I started writing when I was about 23 because I wanted to make £100. And I wrote a novel and I made about £100, which in those days worth about £1,000 now, I suppose. And then I got into the habit of it.
What prompted you to become a professional writer? It wasn't necessity. You didn't need money for it.
Oh, yes.
Really?
Oh, yes, I've always needed money. Terribly. I entirely earn my living. I haven't got any money except what I earn at all.
At an early stage, you had to earn your living.
Yes. Well, I didn't have to earn my living, but if I wanted anything extra to go to the south of France or buy clothes or anything, I had to earn it, you see.
Was it easy for you to get published?
Yes, I never had any trouble. Luckily, because I think if I had, it would have put me off completely. I don't think I'd ever have gone on.
Nancy Mitford was the oldest of Lord Redesdale's 7 children. Ironically, she's probably best remembered for You and Non-You, an article about class distinction in speech which was originally published in Noblesse Oblige. Her other works are far more interesting. The pre-war novels are farcical spoofs of upper-class goings-on in Scotland, London and the West Country, and she ended her career as a distinguished historical biographer. But immediately after the war, she published her masterpieces, The Pursuit of Love and Love in a Cold Climate. They describe the affairs of a large, eccentric aristocratic family, and they are highly autobiographical.
It was an exact portrait of my family, with the characters muddled up a little bit into each other, the characters of the children, and the character of my father and mother absolutely exact. And my father was Uncle Matthew, my mother was Aunt Sadie, and they were as exact or more exact than if I'd been writing about them in memoirs or a true account. I don't think really that I invented anything about either of them.
The children, between Louisa's 11 and Matt's 2 years, sit round the table in party dresses or frilly bibs, according to how old they are, all of them gazing at the camera with large eyes opened wide to the flash, and all looking as if butter would not melt in their round, pursed-up mouths. There they sit, held like flies in the amber of that moment. Click goes the camera, and on goes life. The minutes, the days, the years, the decades, taking them further and further from that happiness and promise of youth, from the hope Aunt Sadie must have had for them all, and from the dream they dreamed for themselves. I often think there is nothing quite so poignantly sad as old family groups.
Do you remember that photograph itself being taken?
Oh, yes, very well. A photographer used to come out from Oxford, and it bored us intensely. We had to dress up in our best clothes and sit there for hours while he organised it all. And then the photograph would emerge. And it was done about every 4 years as we grew up, so that there was a continuous line of them. On the far left is my mother, and then on the top steps is Nancy, and then Tom, and then I'm next, and then my father. And then if you go down again, there's Unity sitting on the lowest step, and Diana a little bit above her. And then there's Jessica, and Deborah again on the lowest step, and then there's the 2 dogs, Ruby and Andy.
Her brother Tom was killed in action in Burma during the war. Her sister Unity attempted suicide when war was declared and died finally in 1948.
Come here.
Pamela Jackson is the eldest of the 4 sisters who remember Nancy in this film. She's a countrywoman who still lives in Gloucestershire, the setting of The Pursuit of Love and the home of the Mitford family.
There he. Look out not to be kicked.
She rears a rare breed of Swiss chicken, Alpenzeller Spitzhauben. Before her death, Nancy had something to say about all her sisters.
First thing I remember is the birth of my sister Pam, which threw me into a permanent rage for about 20 years.
Come on, Mine.
I was so furious not being the only one. Now I feel sorry for people with family planning who don't have brothers and sisters. I think it must be awful for them. That's my sister Diana, who was born beautiful, always beautiful, is still beautiful. She's one of those. There are certain people, always beauties from the moment they enter the cradle.
Diana was first married to Brian Guinness, by whom she had 2 sons, one of whom, Jonathan, will also appear in this film. She later married Sir Oswald Mosley, with whom she lives in a miniature chateau outside Paris. Jessica Truehaft is married to an American lawyer. Radical in her politics since childhood, she was at one time a member of the Communist Party in America, where she now lives. She's published 2 volumes of autobiography and several books of investigative journalism, including The American Way of Death.
My sister Jessica seized our home life through, whatever it was, 15 years of living in America. And then I think she saw it a little bit through the eyes of my novels also.
Chatsworth is one of the largest and most beautiful houses in England. It is the seat of the Duke of Devonshire. His wife, Deborah, is mistress and manager of the place, and she's Nancy's youngest sister.
Hello, Eric.
The youngest is Deborah, and she's 16 years younger than me, and she's my goddaughter. And when she was born, our parlour maid, Mabel, who we worshipped, said, I knew it was a girl by the look on his lordship's face. Because they'd already got 5, poor things. They didn't want a 6th daughter very much. She's turned out rather satisfactorily.
Yes. Same, Father Christmas. Yeah. I see.
The Mitford family spent their childhood and youth in 3 large West Country houses. First Batsford, then Astle, and finally, in 1926, they moved to Swinbrook, which Lord Redesdale had rebuilt to accommodate his ever-growing family. Here there were grounds and outhouses and stables where the children could indulge their passion for animals of every sort.
For example, I had Miranda, the most adorable lamb, when I was about 9, brought her up from a bottle. She adored chocolates. Amazing how all the animals love chocks. And then I also had a dove and various things of that sort, you see. And then Unity had rats and snakes, and we all had whatever we liked. In other words, sort of great rivalry. My lamb, Miranda, versus Unity's goat. So goat-like and sheepish were the expressions. Sheepish meant marvellous. Goat-like meant absolutely horrid in my book, you see, and vice versa in hers. So that's how it went.
How was Nancy, as, shall we say, as a handler?
As a handler of dogs? Well, I mean, she adored that smelly old boarder, Peter.
We each had a mouse. Nancy had a black and white mouse, and I had a brown and white mouse. And I got the estate carpenter to make a palace for my mouse. It was a lovely palace for her, and a bedroom and then a run. Nancy was very envious of this and wanted her mouse to join in the palace. So I said she could put the mouse in if we shared the work. So she agreed to that, and I had the first week of feeding and cleaning out. At the end of the week, I suddenly remembered the mice, and I went to look, and they'd been very hungry. My mouse had eaten Nancy's mouse.
Lord Redesdale, or Favre, is immortalised in the novels as Uncle Matthew. It was his example which gave the children their obsession with animals.
He was going to work one morning, and under Blackfriars Bridge he saw a man leading a little pony with a child on it. And he asked if the pony was for sale, and the man said yes. So he went that evening after work to the stables, and he took such a fancy to this pony, it was a little 3-year-old, I think, that he bought it. And he took it home in a hansom cab. And there was nowhere for it to live, really, in the house, because it was a house in Graham Street in London. But there was a dark room on the first floor. So Brownie, the pony, was put in the dark room to live until we went home for the summer to the country. And then we set forth from the station, Waterloo, I think it was, and we went, the guard refused to have Brownie in the guard's van. So my father said, very well, we'll all go in a third-class compartment. In those days, it wasn't usual to travel third class. And we got in, and there was Brownie and two bloodhounds and a dachshund. And I was a baby put up in the rack. And there was Nancy and Nanny and the nursery maid and my mother and father. So nobody else got into the compartment, of course. And we went down like that. Brownie in the train.
One child says to another, "Child hunt tomorrow, Fanny." "Yes, Josh told me. He was in the car, been to see the vet." My Uncle Matthew had 4 magnificent bloodhounds with which he used to hunt his children. 2 of us would go off with a good start to lay the trail, and Uncle Matthew and the rest would follow the hounds on horseback. It was great fun. Once he came to my home and hunted Linda and me over Shenley Common. This caused a most tremendous stir locally. The Kentish weekenders on their way to church were appalled by the sight of 4 great hounds in full cry after 2 little girls. Well, you see, that, I'm afraid, is poetic license, because in fact my father only had 1 bloodhound. But it's quite true he used to hunt us with it. We used to love seeing the cleverness of the bloodhound, following exactly where one had been.
In The Pursuit of Love, there's a frightfully funny thing which I think is based on fact, and I'd rather like to know, that he used to write down people's names, who he particularly disliked, and used to put them, these names, pieces of paper, into various drawers.
Oh, yes, stuck with pins.
That's true.
Yes. Somebody, he didn't like somebody, used to call them a meaningless piece of meat.
I sort of had a theory that he was the missing link between Homo sapiens and the apes. And he was called the old subhuman, you see. And he used to let me measure his cranium to find out the sort of shape and size of his skull to send into science, you know.
Well, he was very frightening, there's no doubt about it. I remember him turning a friend of Nancy's out of the house because the friend bent down to pick something up for my father and a comb fell out of his pocket. My father thought that was disgusting, so he was out in the middle of the night.
Was it not fair to say that your father would suddenly, capriciously take an immense liking to the most unlikely person?
Yes, he was amazing in that way. For instance, poor Mark Ogilvy Grant, who figures very largely, you know, in the letters in Harold Acton's book, well, he was suddenly taken a liking to. And this was rather worse for poor Mark, you see, being liked, than loathed in one way, because he was expected, being liked, to be down at breakfast at 8 sharp, you see. And then my father would sort of say, "Good morning, Mark, brains for breakfast," upon which poor Mark would go to a total tailspin, you see. And so he was always known as Brains after that in the family.
The thing about my father was he simply hadn't got enough to do. He was a very strong, healthy young man, and he hadn't got anything to do. And the other, naturally, it made him bad-tempered, you know. One can understand it, really. And the other day I had to send for a birth certificate. I'm buying a house. And it put David Mitford, occupation honourable.
This is the River Windrush, one of the most famous trout streams in England. And I very well remember an incident happening when I was a child about this river. My father loved the fishing. And in Nancy's book, Love in a Cold Climate, there's this piece about what actually happened. The famous trout stream that ran through the valley below Alconley was one of Uncle Matthew's most cherished possessions. But he had trouble with the coarse fish, especially the chub, which not only gobble up the baby trout, but also their food, and they were a great worry to him. Then one day he came upon an advertisement in Exchange and Mart, send for the chub fuddler. The Radletts always said that their father had never learnt to read, but in fact he could read quite well, if really fascinated by his subject, and the proof is that he found the chub fuddler like this all by himself. He sat down then and there and sent. It took him some time, breathing heavily over the writing paper and making, as he always did, several copies of the letter before finally sealing and stamping it. The fellow says here to enclose a stamped and addressed envelope, but I don't think I'll pander to him. He can take it or leave it. He took it. He came, he walked along the river bank, and sowed upon its waters some magic seed, which soon bore magic fruit, for up to the surface, flapping, swooning, fainting and choking, thoroughly and undoubtedly fuddled, came hundreds upon hundreds of chub. The entire male population of the village, warned beforehand and armed with rakes and landing nets, fell upon the fish, several wheelbarrows were filled, and the contents taken off to be used as manure for cottage gardens, or chub pie according to taste. Such a laugh. Oh, the chub fuddler.
I must remember it's a very long time ago now, all that. And my father, who was a very clever person in his way, quite uneducated himself, like a peasant, more like a very clever peasant. He wasn't in any way an intellectual at all. Well, then he'd heard from somebody, I don't know who, that if girls went to school, they developed thick calves from playing hockey. And he was very much against these thick calves, which he thought was hideous. And so that our education was completely neglected.
Well, in her teens, when she was about, well, first of all, you see, there was this great complaint that she wanted to go to school and that my father wouldn't allow it. I think the trouble was, you see, Unity went to school and then she was always expelled. Each time she went to 3 schools and it ended in failure, always. And then we used to say she's been expelled again, and my mother used to say, no, darling, no, just ask to leave. There was supposed to be a great distinction between the two, but she didn't do anything very terrible, but they didn't ever want to keep her.
Uncle Matthew said, you don't have to go to some awful middle-class establishment in order to know who George III was. Anyway, who was he, Fanny? Alas, I always failed to shine on these occasions, my wits scattered to the 4 winds by my terror of Uncle Matthew. I said, scarlet in the face, he was king, he went mad. Most original, full of information, said Uncle Matthew sarcastically. Well worth losing every ounce of feminine charm to find that out, I must say. Legs like gateposts from playing hockey, and the worst seat on a horse of any woman I ever knew. Give a horse a sore back as soon as look at it. Linda, you're uneducated, thank God. What have you got to say about George III? Well, said Linda, her mouth full, he was the son of poor Fred, and the father of Beau Brummell's fat friend, and he was one of those vacillators, you know. I'm His Highness's dog at Kew. Pray tell me, sir, whose dog are you? She added inconsequently, oh, how sweet.
This is a letter from Nancy to my mother when Nancy was 14, and it describes a visit to the opera when they went to see Faust. And of course that must have been a terrific occasion because we never went anywhere or did anything like that, so it was very special. Darling Marv, Nanny says, as I'm writing, she won't, and that we are all quite well. Faust was lovely, except that they missed out the scene in the cathedral. I can't think why. As Favre says, that was one of the best. The only one that acted well was Meffy. Margarita and the others were all more hideous than it's possible to imagine. But Meffy was lovely and not at all affected, and simply made me shiver. He was dressed in black and red and was all pointed like this, and frightfully fat. Faust had hair like this and was very ugly and affected, and when he tried to tremble, he shook himself like a dog. Valentine wasn't bad and sang a lot of stuff after being stabbed, which is more than I could or would do. Faust came in at the last dressed like a respectable old lady in a black blouse covered with jet, and an ordinary black skirt, which I discovered afterwards to be a black cloak and leggings. He was an ass, and at first, when he appeared in a dressing gown, he showed everything through it, as it kept coming open. It was in English, but it might have been in Hindustani for all we understood. We knew it was English, however, as twice during the performance we heard the words, "I love you," and once, "She is mad," and once, "I am dead." It was very creepy, and I rarely began to think it was happening really until they came back and bowed. It was great fun, and I loved it. Love from Coco. PTO, we all do our music. We're all as well as could be expected under the circumstances.
Deborah was Nancy's goddaughter and 16 years her junior. It was Nancy who devised the bewildering network of nicknames for the family. Pamela, on the left, is known as Woman, and Diana, on the right, is Honks, or sometimes Cord. Unity, here wearing a rat on her shoulder, was Bobo. Deborah became Debo, and Jessica Decker, except that when Jessica and Nancy corresponded, they both called each other Darling Sue. Where did the intricate T's come from?
Well, I think it sprang full-blown from Nancy, you see, the Mitford teas. I think she was the originator of it, the great cosmic teas, in which the whole world became a sort of teas put on for our benefit, more or less, you see. She was terribly amusing. I don't mean to say that she was all the time being cruel, but there was a great deal of cruelty, too, in the amusing bits.
Yes, well, you see, we had very little to do, I suppose, and so she was able to sort of sit about and think up these terrific teases. And once she said to my sister Unity and Jessica and myself, "Do you realise, you three, what awful middle syllables you've got to your names? Knit, sick and bore." So that kept her going for a few days, made us all cry. We were quite little.
She decided it would be wonderful to be the captain of Girl Guides at home, and she persuaded my parents to think it was an excellent scheme, and Pam and I were to be two of the guides. Well, I said straight away, I don't want to be a guide, the last thing I want to be. So I was told I must be, I forced to be. And then I was told, if you really hate it at the end of a year, you can stop. And at the end of the year, they didn't let me stop. It was one of the great injustices of my childhood. And the whole thing was really invented by Nancy in order to tease me, at least I think so.
Nancy always said that, and did until she died, that I was the mental age of 9. She'd got a point, I'm afraid, there. And she always said I couldn't read. And it was a terrific effort, and I had to do it pointing with my deformed thumb.
When you say she's got a point, how do you mean?
Well, I hardly can read.
You don't like it much?
Hate it. Hate books.
Well, Nancy hated getting up in the morning, and so she never wanted to get up and pull the curtains. And she persuaded me to get up and pull the curtains every morning if she paid me a penny a month. And before the end of the month was up, my parents discovered this, and they were furious because it was much too little for the work that I was doing, pulling the curtains, and they said it was to stop. So then Nancy refused to pay me the penny because the month wasn't up.
Every Christmas there was a fancy dress party at which all the Mitfords dressed up. Nancy's talent for disguise amounted to genius.
In 1926, there was a general strike in England. So naturally, my sisters all became strike breakers, helpers of the strike breakers. And so Nancy and Pam had a canteen up about a mile away from Astle. And so they'd go and sort of give cups of coffee and sandwiches and so on, you see. So Nancy was sort of never got up early. Pam was the one who was the early shift at the canteen. Nancy always used to say, well, I don't know how to make the sandwiches and so on. And so Pam did all the actual work and Nancy would sort of drift up. So one day at early dawn, Pam was there, perhaps 5 in the morning, and a dreadful tramp came lurching in with a really horrible look to his face. You see, scarred and beastly. So he sort of said, can I have a cup of tea, miss? So Pam was quite terrified and she immediately started to pour the cup of tea, upon which the tramp said, can I have a kiss, miss? And he started darting round the counter to kiss Pam. It turned out to be Nancy, disguised as the tramp. I mean, she went to endless lengths to amuse us. For example, Astle was being sold, and it was bought by a family called the Hardcastles. So one day appeared at the door Mrs. Hardcastle's sister, who's a dreadful-looking person. You see, you can imagine what she looked like, with sort of huge bosoms, extremely fat, and large moustache. And there she was at the door, and she rang the doorbell.
And the parlour maid, Mabel, answered the door. And she said, I'm the sister of the people who are going to buy the house. And they said I could perhaps look over it. So Mabel said, oh, of course, madam, come in. And Mabel showed her all round the ground floor, and then handed over to the old housemaid, Annie, who showed her the top floor and the bedrooms and everything. Then when they came to the nursery,
everything went fairly well, you see, until she suddenly said, lighting upon me, what a dear little girl. And she bent to kiss me. That moustache came close to my face, you know. So apparently my look of total horror was enough for Nancy, and she sort of dropped the disguise then, and all the cushions tumbled out that she put in, you know, for Mrs. Hardcastle's sister's bosom, and everything came clear. But it was, I mean, that was amazing. I mean, to take that trouble and go to that length just to amuse us, I thought.
In 1926, the family moved into Swinbrook. The house was virtually rebuilt so as to accommodate the large family. Each child had its own room, but they looked at Swinbrook in different ways.
Well, I do suppose in some ways it depends on the viewpoint and personality of who's seeing it, you know. I mean, to me it was a bit of a prison. It was a fortress from which I longed to escape. Now, Debo, on the contrary, absolutely adored it. I remember an American couple called the Phelpses who lived in Swinbrook, and Mrs. Phelps, who was an absolute smasher, saying, Debo is perfectly happy picking fleas off Jacob, which was her dog, you see, and she could spend her life doing that. And so in my case, I was always sort of dying to get away.
I first left home, I suppose, at the age of about 21 or 2. But I went to the Slade School, but I went to the Slade School from our house in London.
I see. Why did you go to Slade?
Well, I thought I would like to be a painter. And Professor Tonks put an end to that by saying that I had no talent whatever. But I enjoyed it very much. I loved sitting making silly little drawings all day.
And then you returned home?
And, well, to and fro, you see. I mean, it was my base always until I married. I tried living in a bed-sitting room, but that didn't do quite. I couldn't bear it.
You once said that there was a mound, it just became a mound of underclothes.
It just became a mound of underclothes. I didn't know what to do with them, yes.
Trying to leave home, I think that really has been rather exaggerated, because she was very popular and she did leave home the whole time. I mean, she was invited everywhere. But then time went on, she didn't find the right person to marry, and I think then she would have very much liked to leave home, probably, as most people would when they reached the age of 22 or 3.
From the moment when my brother went to Eton, my brother was a very clever man, indeed. He was killed in the war. From the moment he went to Eton, he brought home his friends, who were people like Nigel Birch, Randolph Churchill, Hinchinbrook, Droider, John Betchman, people like that, and who all came the whole time to the house. So you see, it wasn't completely sort of
a stronghold of idiocy. They were called the Swinbrook Sewers because my father used to say, "Here comes another damn sewer," and that would be a gentleman caller for Nancy. In other words, she had lots of friends that came to stay. There was usually rather a battle, as I remember, with my father about the calibre and quality of said friends. You know, sewers like Evelyn Waugh or John Betchman, etc., were not welcome by him. And so it was always a sort of tug of war going on there, which of course we were tugging on Nancy's side, if you know what I mean. And my mother rather liked having them. So actually the tug of war was usually won.
A lot of people wanted to marry her, but she always turned them down. And then she met Hamish Erskine. She was very much in love with him. I don't know anyone else with whom she was really much in love. She always expected in each party she went to that some sort of fairy prince would turn up.
Hamish Erskine was younger than she was. There was really no future in it, but it did go on for a good many years, really. She was very fond of him and he of her.
In what sort of way was her attachment? What was her attachment, her big attachment?
In what sort of way was unsuitable?
No. What was her attachment? Why did she fall in love with him?
Why do people fall in love? It's a big mystery. I suppose he was attractive in a way, you see. He was very lively, rather good looking. She thought he was fun, amusing, and he thought she was.
It seems to me to have been love rather than infatuation.
Yes, I think so. And I think she felt probably also, possibly a little bit maternal towards him and responsible for him, wanted him to make something of his life. She certainly was very devoted to him.
Then the next person on the scene was the person who was to become her husband, who was?
Who was Prod, as we used to call him, Peter Rodd. I thought Prod a rather glamorous figure. He claimed to have been instrumental in fomenting many rebellions and revolutions in various South American countries and that sort of thing. He was very left-wing, which suited my feelings, and so on, and really very attractive. Now, it's true that he had his boring side, which I'm sure everybody else has told about, you know. We used to call him the old toll-gater, because he once undertook to explain to us the toll gates of England, and so toll-gater became his nickname. But, no, I suppose the fact that Nancy loved him, or was in love with him, was an enormous sort of impetus for me to love him.
I don't remember really much about him. He worked in a bank, I think, or was a stockbroker. I'm not quite sure which. A bank, I'm sure now.
I suppose she met him and the Hamish thing was fizzling out. And he fell in love with her, undoubtedly, and they were married rather soon afterwards.
I think it was a total rebound, probably. And nobody really knows how the affair with Hamish ever did come to the end, because it isn't explained in any of the letters, and she was a tremendously private person. She wasn't telling. She doesn't tell sisters things like that.
Nancy and Peter set up house at Strand-on-the-Green, Chiswick, London.
She had a great talent for making wherever she lived very, very pretty. And that little house was really lovely, and wasn't an ugly thing in it. That was one of her great talents. That and her clothes, and she always had very good food, though she couldn't boil an egg herself.
And there they lived for quite a while. They were always very hard up. And I remember Nancy, I was there one day, Nancy had to entertain for tea what are they called?
The bailiffs.
The bailiffs, yes. The bailiffs came in. And so she kept them calm by entertaining them and giving them tea.
Well, she earned very little from journalism, just enough really to keep alive. Peter Rodd never had much of a job.
Her husband.
Her husband, and I think that up till the war, and at the beginning of the war, she was very, very hard up indeed. But she was extremely careful about money and would never get into debt. That was part of her character.
I was staying the night there and we were dressing for dinner, and Nancy looked out of the window just before we were going out to dinner, and she said, "Oh, there's another body in the river. I must rush and let Mr. Smith know about this." And he was the person who used to go out in his boat and fish the bodies out. And if the body was on the other side of the river, he got a little more money for it than he did this side. So she often waited until it floated a bit over, the current took it more to the other side, before she told him.
Do you remember from that time, did you ever actually watch her writing?
Very much.
What do you describe?
Well, I mean, she'd be there sort of in front of the fireplace, you see, writing away in these exercise books, which you must have seen. And she'd be writing, and then she'd read out bits. Oh, so fascinating. And there was my father. But the point was that she used to sort of, to me, of course, seem like a combination of Charlotte Bronte and Jane Austen, or anyone you can think of who was bold enough to actually write a book. It was thrilling to me to see her doing that.
Did she write with great speed and ease?
I don't think she ever corrected, as you can rather tell by reading what she published in those days. I love them, but, you know, they're obviously full of amazing solecisms and sort of faults of grammar, etc., which is rather charming, really.
What do you think about the 3 pre-war novels, for a long time rather considered not very much?
Especially by her.
Yes.
Hated them.
What do you think of them yourself?
Well, I think they're fun. You know, they're romps, they're fun. You don't want to take them too seriously. Their faults are glaring, but if you don't read them because of the faults, you miss a lot of fun, really. She was ashamed of them because she was a bit of a perfectionist.
But do you think they're radically different from the 4 much more famous mature novels, that is, The Pursuit of Love, Love in a Cold Climate, Blessing, and Don't Tell Alfred?
No, I don't think they're radically different. I think they're a crude version of the same sort of idea. In some ways, they're fresher.
Then she worked for Hayward Hill at the bookshop. And I remember very well her wages there were £3 a week. And that was when she often used to walk from Blumfield Road to save the bus fare. But I do remember once when she was going in the bus and she was in the queue in the blackout. She was hugged by a huge black American soldier. And she shouted out, "Leave me alone, I'm 40.
Well, I enjoyed the war very much. Shame to say. It's an awful thing to say, but you see, it was very lively in London in the war. Everybody was in a very good temper, quite nice, jolly.
Well, then she was a fire watcher, and she learnt exactly what to do, and she gave up 2 nights a week to fire watching in Curzon Street. And then somebody said, would she lecture to new fire watchers? And so she said, yes, she would. So she gave up another night to lecture. And when she'd done it about 3 times, the lady who ran it all asked to see her and said, would you mind giving up the lectures? And she said, no, not the least. But could you tell me why? Well, she said, it's your voice. Your accent irritates people so much they'd like to put you on the fire. It's true.
Have you yourself suffered from having the Mitford voice?
No, never. You see, I've never been a public speaker and I've never been in public life. No doubt if I had, I should have suffered. But it's just been my private sorrow to have the Mitford voice.
Yeah.
What do you feel about it yourself?
Well, we're saddled with it, aren't we? It's awful. Living in the north of England, it's even sillier than it is anywhere else.
But you don't personally mind it much, do you?
I'm afraid I do, yes, but I can't change it. I'm too old.
What do you think it sounds like to other people?
It's ridiculous. And you can see them thinking it.
As all families, you were very much separated during the war. Because
Yes, we were, because transport was so difficult. You know, she was in London. My mother and Unity were at Swinbrook at the Swan Inn, the Mill Cottage, and I was in my house near Deddington. Deborah was up in Derbyshire when she married. She married in 1940, I think it was, 41. Diana was in prison.
Why was I in prison? Well, we opposed the war, and there was a regulation called Regulation 18B, under which people could be arrested without charge or trial and kept for as long as the Home Secretary thought it was a good idea. And we were years and years in prison. And Nancy at that time was working in bookshop at Hayward Hill. And she used to come and see me. She also, of course, sent masses of books. So she was a great help.
When your husband was head of British Unionists, which in fact was very closely allied to German fascism, how did your family behave towards you?
You see, I don't really think politics make such an enormous difference within the family. Obviously, there were things I wouldn't agree with Nancy about certain things. She wouldn't agree with me. But there was the whole of our childhood together, so I don't think it really made a very big breach between us.
Even at that time, at that period?
Well, perhaps more than later, yes.
This letter was written in November 1968, when Sir Oswald Mosley's autobiography had just come out. And she said, "Have you noted all the carry-on about Sir Oz? He says he was never anti-Semitic. Good gracious! Exclamation mark. I quite love the old soul now, but really, dash, another exclamation. Also, I'm very cross with him for saying Tom, our brother, was a fascist, which is untrue, though, of course, Tom was a fearful old twister and probably was a fascist when with Diana. When with me, he used to mock to any extent, and he hated Sir Oz, no doubt about that. If Randolph had been alive, he would have sprung to his defence. I miss Randolph. That's Randolph Churchill."
In this particular letter, there are two errors of fact, which I would like to comment on. First of all, she says that my husband was anti-Semitic. Well, an anti-Semite is someone who dislikes Jews on account of their religion or their race, which is something my husband never did. And the other thing is connected with my brother Tom. He was what I think communists call a card-carrying member of the British Union. And at the end of the war, when we were living in Berkshire under house arrest, he always spent his leaves with us, which is something you don't do if you're not rather fond of the person you're going to stay with.
How long a time was your brother Tom a member of the British Unionists?
Quite a short time. I think he probably joined in 1938, and I think he probably also joined the Territorial Army. I think what he thought was there would probably be a war, and if there were a war, he would like to be a soldier. But if there were no war, he thought that a radical political change was needed in England.
When you say that you and your husband, Sir Oswald, were in no way anti-Semitic, what was your attitude towards the Jews?
There was no specific attitude towards the Jews as Jews. There was a great disagreement with certain Jews over the question of whether there should be war or not. We were very anti-war, and they were very pro-war. It was as simple as that.
Well, I thought I'd read from Whigs on the Green, perhaps one of her least-known books, which was published in the late 30s, and almost triggered a frightful family row, even by our family standards, quite huge, because actually the book is a terrific send-up of Sir Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists, and of my sister Unity, who's thinly disguised in that as Eugenia. So here's a bit of it. You see, here's Eugenia. "Britain's awake, arise, O British lion," cried Eugenia Malmains in thrilling tones. She stood on an overturned wash-tub on Chelford village green and harangued about a dozen aged yokels. Her straight hair, cut in a fringe, large pale blue eyes, well-proportioned limbs and classical features combined with a certain fanaticism of gesture to give her the aspect of a modern Joan of Arc. She was dressed in an ill-fitting grey woolen skirt, no stockings, a pair of threadbare plimsolls, and a jumper made apparently out of a Union Jack. Round her waist was a leather belt to which there was attached a large bright dagger. At this point, a very old lady came up to the crowd, pushed her way through it, and began twitching at Eugenia's skirt. "Eugenia, my child," she said brokenly, Do get off that tub. Pray, please get down at once. Go away, Nanny, said Eugenia, who in the rising tide of oratory seemed scarcely aware that she'd been interrupted.
Your sister Unity, having been a friend of Hitler's, was this an embarrassment to you? Because you were politically very different.
Yes, it wasn't an embarrassment, it was a terrible sadness. It was dreadful. But,
Why do you think she was so impressed with the fact
well,
that
she was very young, you know. She was in Munich learning German. And I must say, all the English girls who were in Munich learning German marched and sang, and they would all deny it now, but it is the truth then. People forget what it was like. It wasn't so spat upon at the beginning, you see, as it is now, as it became naturally ever since the war. For instance, Ribbentrop in London had the most elegant embassy in London. Everybody went. They forget that now. It wasn't only Unity.
Did she change her views when the war started?
Well, when she discovered that England and Germany were going to war, she tried to kill herself. She couldn't do more, really. Terribly sad, the whole thing.
Were you ever a socialist?
Well, I've always been a sort of vague socialist, yes.
But you voted for socialism?
Yes.
Immediately after the war, Nancy went to stay in Paris, and she never returned to live in England again. Deborah, why do you think Nancy went to live in France after the war?
Well, I don't think she'd had a very happy time in England, and she had no real reason to stay in any special place. That's to say, she had no children, you see, and she was completely free. She was, by that time, not really married anymore. And she just loved France. And it was a sort of dream world, which she loved till she died. And we always used to be so amused because she used to say, going across the channel, thick fog in London, halfway across the channel, sun came out, everything was perfect.
The first flat she had, really, it was hers, that she rented on a lease. It was 7 Rue Monsieur, the ground floor, a very charming flat between courtyard and garden.
When you saw her in Paris, can you describe a little bit about what it would be like when you went there to Monsieur? How she'd greet you? What was the atmosphere?
Well, it was a marvellous combination of really sophisticated Paris flat with lovely furniture and everything, and the basic countrywoman, funnily enough, that Nancy was, because in the heyday of Rue Monsieur, she had not only a pet cat, but a pet chicken, which used to run about the drawing room and about the garden.
But the metropolitan side of Nancy blossomed in Paris. With the financial success of The Pursuit of Love, she could at last indulge her passion for smart and expensive clothes.
I thought she was the super height of elegance. You only had looked at photos of her in those wonderful things, you know. And she was always on to me about how shabby I was, which is true. I remember once she took me to Dior, you see, and she absolutely forced me in there. I'd just made some money on a book. And she said, come on, and she sort of knew the vendeurs, you know. And there she was, sort of bossing me around and subliminally whispering to me and the vendeurs, this is my sister, she is so riche, she kept saying, you see. It's beastly of her. And she got me into a $700 outfit. You see, which is incredibly more than I'd ever spent for anything in my life. I can only say that I'm still wearing it.
This was Grace. And it says, Grace was off on her hobby horse now. Have you ever noticed it's just those very things the English pride themselves on most which are better here? Trains, more punctual. Tweeds, more pretty. Football, the French always win. Doctors, can't be compared. Nobody ever dies here till they're 100. Horses, we've got Monsieur Boussac. The post, the roads, the police, France is far better administered.
In The Pursuit of Love, Linda, the headstrong but goose-like Radlett girl, runs away. She arrives in Paris penniless and frightened of white slave traffickers.
She became aware that somebody was standing beside her. A short, stocky, very dark Frenchman in a black Homburg hat. He was laughing. Linda took no notice but went on crying. The more she cried, the more he laughed. Her tears were tears of rage now, no longer of self-pity. At last she said, in a voice which was meant to be angrily impressive, but which squeaked and shook through her handkerchief, Allez-vous-en! For answer, he took her hand and pulled her to her feet. Bonjour, bonjour, he said. Voulez-vous vous en aller? Said Linda, rather more doubtfully. Here at least was a human being who showed signs of taking some interest in her. Then she thought of South America. Il faut expliquer que je ne suis pas, she said, une esclave blanche. Je suis la fille d'un très important lord anglais. The Frenchman gave a great bellow of laughter. One does not, he said, in the nearly perfect English of somebody who has spoken it from a child, have to be Sherlock Holmes to guess that.
When I read The Pursuit of Love, which I did with incredible pleasure and amusement when it came out, I did write to her saying, as I know that you never write from imagination, I can see that you're now having an affair with a Frenchman in Paris. And she sort of wrote back and said yes, you know.
Yes. But first of all, I must talk about the conquest of Nancy by France. And I must say, I've never seen anyone who understood better the spirit of France and was more fascinated by the spirit. Perhaps because she had a certain ideal of life. Not, how do you say, hedonistic?
No.
No, but a sort of life of free thought, tinged with spiritualism, but of freedom of thought. And that she found in France.
Well, we're allowed to say that the Frenchman's name is the Colonel. Did you get to meet the Colonel?
Yes, I did. You see, the thing is, I sort of knew about the Colonel, and then I found out that Mav knew, which is most extraordinary. I mean, imagine, you know, Mav knowing of somebody having an affair, not married. I mean, and she must have changed hugely, which she did, in fact, I suppose. And sort of allowing the name of the Colonel to be mentioned in letters. So I wrote to Mav saying that the Colonel sounds to me like a sort of mixture between Colonel Bailey, one of our sort of country hard-riding squire uncles, and Maurice Chevalier. And my mother wrote back and said, that's a very good description.
I think she was devoted to him. It was, I think it was the third big thing in her life.
I think she was deeply in love with him. She was always deeply in love. That was her nature. And she was a very faithful lover, you know. I mean, she never looked to right or left. I mean, she was absolutely for the one. And I think she was like that with Prod all those years, and with Hamish before, and so forth. I mean, I think she was an amazingly, well, you said romantic, which is probably right, but I mean, really sort of loving one person.
Then, do you remember the first sighting of her in 1955? Could you describe that to us?
Well, it wasn't so much a sighting as a hearing. What happened is that Bob Trueheft, my present husband, Dinky, Esmond's child, then aged about 14, and I, we'd all come to Europe for the very first time, having been forbidden passports for being subversives in America, you see. So we got there, and I'd had the most passionate letters from Nancy saying, it will be like a dream to see you again, and whatever happens, you've got to let me know your exact movements so that I can fit mine in, because I've got things to do, and I will absolutely turn handsprings and so forth, you see, so we can meet. So, having this in mind, we were in Paris and couldn't find her telephone number. So we drove over to her flat and were finally admitted by Marie, her maid, who said, to our despair, that she was in England, staying with La Duchesse de Devonshire. So I rang up long distance to see how much it would cost to make a telephone call to England. It wasn't all that expensive. It was about the equivalent of, well, an American dollar or 10 bob English, you know. So I started doing it, and it took hours getting through with all that crick, 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 you know how the French are. And ne quittez pas. So anyway, finally, all of a sudden, I hear her voice for the first time in 16 years. I was actually sort of amazed and so on. I said, Susan, is that you? And she said, yes, Susan, where are you? And I said, I'm telephoning from your flat in Paris. She said, you beast, it's frightfully expensive. And she simply hung up like that. And then, sort of a little while later, she did ring back as Bob said, on Debo's nickel from Chatsworth, and we had a lovely chat. But I mean, she was like that. She was so odd about money.
In the 1960s, she went on to become a highly successful historical biographer. Her subjects included the Sun King, Madame de Pompadour, and Frederick the Great.
When she changed gear, as it were, and became a distinguished biographer rather than a comic novelist, did this in fact come as something as a surprise to her friends and relations?
Yes, I think perhaps it did, because you see, she was never educated, whatever education may mean. I always think once you've learnt to read, you do the rest yourself, but I know that's not the fashionable view. But she never had a formal education. Therefore, I suppose people thought she could just dash off those novels, but I don't think they ever thought she'd have the application to sit down and do the research for the serious books, which indeed she did, and very successfully. They took quite a lot out of her.
Well, I like Madame de Pompadour. There's a wonderful review, I can't remember who it was by, but it was rather sort of put it in its place, saying that Nancy Mitford has simply taken the Mitford sisters and put them down in the setting of Versailles and put all of their jokes into the mouths of Pompadour, etc. You see, it was a good point, actually, by that reviewer.
Well, that was A.J.P. Taylor.
Was it?
And you really think that was accurate?
Well, I do rather. I mean, I roared when I saw the review because I recognised the truthfulness.
The fact is that the king liked family life and could hardly have enough of it. This the courtiers, who saw him so regal and terrifyingly aloof, could never quite understand. As for the bourgeois idiom of his mistress, he thought it quite delightfully funny, and very soon he was heard calling his daughters by the most outrageous nicknames. Locke for Madame Adélaïde, Coche for Madame Victoire, Chiffre for Madame Louise. Madame de Pompadour had nicknames for everybody all her life. Her friends, her pet animals, even her houses were continually called by new names when she spoke or wrote of them. She was indeed a change from the women of the court, who with certain notable exceptions were self-conscious, artificial, preoccupied with their rank and privileges, and very dull. The French aristocrats, since they were also courtiers, had nearly all adopted the muted tones and careful behaviour of that profession. Breezy, eccentric noblemen, so common in England, where they led an independent life on their own estates, were almost unknown in France. Certain members of the royal family were an exception. The Comte de Charolais was a rip-snorting oddity. He dressed like a gamekeeper and ordered his coachman to run over any monks he might see on the road, but he could afford such vagaries as he was a cousin of the king's.
By the late 1960s, Nancy had fallen seriously ill with cancer, from which she never recovered.
Yes, she had 4 years of the most terrible illness you could ever imagine. Sometimes the pain was so excruciating that she just sat in bed crying. Sometimes there was a little let up, and then she thought she was getting better, and then back it came. I think she saw 22 doctors, and each time they said, "Oh, you must give my cure a little while to work. 3 weeks you'll see everything's going to be different." And the 3 weeks used to pass, and back it came again. It was on all during those 3 weeks, and she just lived in hopes, and nothing worked, and nobody ever really discovered what it was, or at least they never really seemed to.
It was some form of cancer then?
Yes.
Yes.
When she was dying, and didn't know it, obviously, at the time, this is the sort of thing she wrote, which you can't imagine what it meant from her, of all people, to write in this vein. "Darling Sue, I'm in such extremities of pain, I don't write. It's really too depressing for you. I know Debo doesn't care for such letters. Yesterday nothing was any good. I've got a horrid old nurse I hate. She gave me an injection, but 0. Today, better. Isn't it odd? The funny thing is, one has moments of happiness, especially now that spring is here, but the pain is fearful. The book has arrived already. This, incidentally, is a reference to Christopher Isherwood's book about his parents, which she loved. It was one of the last things she read. I've heard of it, and I'm sure to enjoy it, thank you. At present, I'm deep in Gibbon, which is not a great English classic for nothing. So wonderful. They, the classics, rarely let you down, I find. And then they're so nice and long. Dear Duck, think of me, love Sue."
And you and your sisters kept an almost perpetual vigil with her, did you not?
Well, Diana was on the spot, and she used to go very, very often indeed, because she lived in France. My sister Decca came from America many times on purpose to see her. And so did Pam, and so of course did I. I mean, we all did.
One morning, I had a strange feeling that I must go and see her. And I came, I found her very ill. And she just, I think, recognized me and had a sort of a shadow of a smile, and she died 2 hours afterwards. That was our last meeting.
She'd always wanted to be buried in Swinbrook, so we did that for her. And this tombstone was put with the mole on it because she didn't like a cross because she said it was a symbol of cruelty, which of course it is. And that's why I just thought of something out of our own crest would be nicer. And she loved moles and had moles everywhere, on her writing paper, on the books that she wrote her books in, on the exercise books, and even on some of her luggage and writing cases. Sometimes people think it's a duck-billed platypus. It does look rather like one, but if you look, you can see that it's a mole.
After Nancy's funeral, I got an incredibly nice letter from my sister Diana, which I should like to read. Darling Decca, I'm staying with woman, really. Not as above, meaning her address. We had Nancy's funeral yesterday. Swinbrook was looking wonderful, green and summery and blue sky. There were many friends, and none of those ghastly people who crowd into memorial services. Debo is sending the obituary from the Times, which was the only good one, Raymond Mortimer. Her grave is next to Bowd's. Well, darling, that's it. You were more than wonderful to have come, and I'm so thankful we settled for June, which is when I did go, since July would have been too late. I enclose what the Colonel and I put in Figaro, and a letter to make you laugh. Throw, of course, all love cord. I mean, that was so nice to get.
Have you got any particular faith yourself?
Well, I believe in God in a besotted kind of way. I firmly believe in a future life, which I believe will be absolutely heavenly, every respect, because naturally, of course, I think I shall go straight to heaven. And I envisage it as a beautiful park full of lovely little, divinely pretty little houses inhabited by one's friends. I look forward greatly.
And lots of lovely music, like The Lost Chord.
And The Lost Chord, absolutely non-stop, yes. You know my taste, don't you? 100 best tunes, booming out from morning till night. Oh, how lovely it'll be. With an occasional nightingale.